Grisaille still life. Grisaille. Grisaille painting is a technique in which an image is executed entirely in shades of gray. Grisaille is also known as dead color painting. In the Flemish technique, the grisaille layer is applied on top of the umber underpainting after it has dried. Traditionally, the grisaille layer is an underpainting on top of which the final color layers are applied. However, a well-executed grisaille painting can be considered a finished work on its own. In this example, we see a grisaille painting of a single object. On the left-hand side of the canvas, there is a value scale. We can see in this painting that a grisaille painting can be approached in a very loose manner, using broad strokes to define general areas of light and dark. Here's another grisaille painting of a single object, which is not quite as loose as the first one. Keep in mind that the grisaille painting serves traditionally as an underpainting on top of which color will be added. So during the color stage, more refinement can take place. Our second grisaille painting will be made up of multiple objects, so let's take a look at some examples of still life setups that use multiple objects, and let's take advantage of this to talk about some compositional elements. In this piece, we see right off the bat that the level of finish compared to the previous two examples is much more refined, and the modeling of the values, the blending between values, is much more subtle. I'd also like to point out, in terms of composition, arrangement, and choosing your objects, that this piece contains a nice interplay between various forms: circular forms, elliptical forms, triangular forms, and rectilinear forms. And especially nice is the interplay between the shadow that's being cast by the cup and the light area of this vase, which create a kind of elliptical connection, an S-curve that connects the two sections. These are all things that are considered, that should be considered when choosing objects, and when you do consider these things carefully, they're more fun to paint and they're more fun to look at. In contrast to the previous piece, where there was a nice variety of different shapes working together, this piece focuses on circular and semicircular form. However, I'd like to point out the use of the tabletop, the back edge, the front edge, not just to denote background, middle ground, and foreground, but to serve as a kind of contrasting element, a strong geometric rectilinear element that works with the circular forms within and creates a nice subdivision of the flat plane of the canvas as well. Everything, essentially, in a still life painting can be part of the composition. Again, in this piece, we see a nice use of elliptical and semicircular forms as a unifying visual motif. However, this piece is different from the previous examples in that the objects are not placed right in the middle of the canvas. The artist has zoomed in and cropped the objects on the left and the right side, creating a more dynamic composition as a result, and also establishing a focal point. And in this painting, we see an even more extreme example of cropping in which the artist has zoomed in so that there's really no sense of the environment or the setting in which these objects are situated. In this beautiful little grisaille painting, I'd like to point out several aspects in regards to composition, so we'll spend a little bit of time on this piece. First off, I'd like to point out the strong rectilinear element that's created by the vertical orientation of the bottle and the horizontal orientation of the ladle, which is also picked up by this shape in the background, which is similar in value. Background information that bleeds into the middle ground and foreground, but creates a similar shape, a backwards L, that creates a sense of structure and balance in the piece. The bottle and the ladle are contrasted nicely, the verticality and the horizontality of the two, by these two elements. And these two elements are similar in terms of their shape and value, but they relate to one another along a subtle diagonal axis. They contrast nicely with the bottle and the ladle, but they also create a very nice and unified arrangement of objects. Now we'll talk a little bit about what's called the envelope, which essentially is the basic shape, a general geometric shape that is formed by the outer contours of an arrangement of objects. So if we start at the top of the bottle and work our way down a straight line to the ladle and come across to the bottom right, and then back up again, we get a very strong triangular shape. And again, it's an integral part of the composition, something that artists may begin with in terms of basing a grouping of objects or arranging a composition before filling in details. Now that's called an envelope. In the background, we have strong vertical line, a subtly curved horizontal line, and in the foreground, a subtle diagonal. So all of these things contrast nicely, but also harmonize nicely, and they pick up on each other. Now, in terms of value, value within a composition is really key. The distribution of values, to be specific. Darker values carry more visual weight than lighter values, so they need to be balanced out. So the distribution of values is important. In this section, we have a large expanse of a middle gray, and that needs to be balanced out, and it is balanced out nicely by the dark value of the bottle, as well as the shadows of these forms over here. The dark value of the bottle is also picked up over here, over on the left side, by the values within the ladle and also the shadows of the ladle. And the shadows make a nice connection between all these elements. So distribution of light and dark elements within a piece also serve to balance out the piece. So those things need to be considered. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the rule of thirds. And in looking at this composition, I would not be surprised, and it looks like the artist used the rule of thirds to establish the general arrangement of objects. If we recall, we discussed the rule of thirds in the PowerPoint presentation that was devoted to composition. So if we work our way across 1/3 of the way from right to left, subdivide the canvas in thirds, we have the general placement of the bottle. And if we work our way down 2/3 of the way, from top to bottom, or 1/3 of the way up, we have the general axis, horizontal axis of these objects here. So in looking at this piece, again, I would not be surprised if the artist utilized the rule of thirds in creating the overall arrangement, as well as the distribution of values and geometric shapes that serve to create a nice sense of balance, structure, unity, and harmony in the piece. Once again, we see a nice interplay of similar forms, circular and semicircular. But in this piece, I see something quite interesting, and that's the negative space within the letter form that picks up on the oval shape of the egg. Negative shapes are a crucial element of a composition as well. The other thing I'd like to point out is the compact arrangement, which is an option. We can arrange objects in different ways. And in the next slide, you'll see a completely different setup. In this painting, we see a completely different setup in which the objects are spread out on the tabletop. So in terms of the arrangement, it's less compact than the previous example. We also see a nice interplay between horizontal elements, vertical elements, diagonal elements that create the crux of the composition, and circular forms that are distributed throughout that also serve to balance out those geometric aspects.